friends, and warm welcome to my lecture series on posthuman transformation and ancient Mediterranean thought. It's a pleasure to have all of you here with me today, and I'm going to be looking in this session at chapter 1 of my book, Posthuman Transformation. And if you want an introduction, I've already done that in a prior video, so backtrack there. I'm hoping that in this series you will get a sense for the book and whether you want to buy it. It is helpful to see these videos while reading the book, but if you want to use these as a kind of preview, you're more than welcome. Let's begin. So chapter 1 is called Hesiod and Demonification in the Archaic and Classical Periods. In other words, this chapter focuses on the poet Hesiod, and it's well worth taking a quick look at some of his data, shall we say, for background. Hesiod was a historical poet from Boeotia, that is in central Greece, whose family, as he says, came from a place in Asia Minor, now modern Turkey. He's most famous for claiming to be inspired by the Muses on Mount Helicon, and he's best known for two major poems, the Theogony, or Birth of Gods, and the Works and Days. And it's the Works and Days that we'll focus on in this session. I can recommend a translation for both of those by Glenn Most in the Low Classical Library, but these poems are widely available in other translations and online. It's interesting that, according to legend, Hesiod himself became a hero or a demigod, and according to tradition at least, the transfer of his bones stopped a plague and were in display in Orchomenus 800 years after his death, and they were seen by Pausanias, from whom we get this story. Hesiod was supposedly murdered and thrown into the ocean, but his body was recovered by a pod of dolphins. All of this is to say that probably none of that is historical, except the fact that his bones were being shown, much like a saint's bones would be shown in a church today in Europe. So he was and continued to be a very important thinker or poet, I should say, in the Greco-Roman educational system, and many of the Greek and Roman elite could quote Hesiod by heart. So if you pick up a copy of the Works and Days, you'll read how the poem centers around Hesiod's own conflict with his brother Perses, who has, in Hesiod's viewpoint, stolen the inheritance of their father. And what the poem is about is a series of stories, at least at first, addressed on the topic of justice and the justice of Zeus. Not all the stories seem to be very closely connected, but one of them is the story of the metal generations. And this story is told after the story of Pandora and before the story of the hawk who catches the nightingale. But I want to read you a portion of the metal generation story, because according to Hesiod, there was first what he calls a race of gold. And in the translation of Glenn Most, starting at line 109, we have, "Golden was the race of speech-endowed human beings, which the immortals who have their mansions on Olympus made first of all. They lived at the time of Kronos, when he was king in the sky. Just like gods, they spent their lives with a spirit free from care, entirely apart from toil and distress. Worthless old age did not oppress them, but they were always the same in their feet and hands, and delighted in festivities, lacking in all evils. They died as if overpowered by sleep. They had all good things. The grain-giving field bore crops of its own accord, much and unstinting, and they themselves, willing, mild-mannered, shared out the fruits of their labors together with many good things, wealthy in sheep, dear to the blessed gods. But since the earth covered up this race, by the plan of great Zeus, they are fine spirits, here daimones, fine daimones upon the earth, guardians of mortal human beings. They watch over judgments and cruel deeds, clad in invisibility, walking everywhere upon the earth, givers of wealth. In this kingly honor they received. Now Hesiod goes on to say that their prerogative of becoming daimones upon the earth was unique to them. The second race of silver became something like heroes under the ground. The third race of bronze was simply destroyed. Hesiod inserts a fourth race of heroes, and he says that he lives in the fifth race of iron, and greatly laments that fact. I'll just note also that at the beginning, or of his introduction to the metal generations, or races if you prefer, Hesiod says that he will speak about how the gods and mortal human beings came about from the same origin, or in Greek, hos hamathen gegaasi theithne tenthropi. And this pretty line is a theory that's sort of like evolution in reverse. In other words, things are getting progressively worse. Things are devolving, not evolving. At the origin of the cosmos, there was no distinction between the race of gods and mortals. But over time, as there have been generation after generation, the branches leading to humanity have further and further departed from the gods, so that Hesiod viewed the gods and humans as sexually compatible. So in that respect, they might have been viewed as the same species. But they were, by his time, so different from the iron race that there was less and less an ability to compare them. And that's where we are. And so in a sense, it's because of the nature of the golden generation, its pristine and closer root connection to the gods, that they received the privilege of becoming daimones. But there's also something in the passage about these people of the golden generation also simply being good. And not just good in the sense of wealthy, but good in the sense of nonviolent, and of sharing, and of being at peace. And this is quite a contrast to all of the other races, including the silver, but especially the bronze and the race of heroes. And of course, the age of iron is named for the sword. So there is something moral going on when we think of the golden generation and why they received this wonderful reward of becoming daimones upon the earth. And just to say a little more about the golden generation, they were said to live like gods on earth. And Glenn Most translates the word daimones by spirits. We could equally translate it by minor divinities. In fact, in Hesiod's time, daemon and theos, that is, daemon and god, aren't very well distinguished. So it's perfectly fine to view daimones as minor divinities. And they are charged with being guardians of mortals, clothed in invisibility or mist, and also givers of wealth. So as they were good during their lives, they are good in their afterlife. And that goodness is determined by their ability to benefit. So they are our guardian angels, so to speak, the spirits who make human life better. A little later in the poem, Hesiod has another few lines about these daimones. He says, "Thrice 10,000 upon the nubile earth are the deathless ones of Zeus, guardians of mortal humans, who watch over just and criminal acts, robed in mist, wandering over the land." There is some new information here. These daimones are deathless. They share that characteristic with the god, and their ability, or their role rather, is to watch over just and criminal acts. So in that case, they are agents of Zeus, and agents specifically of Zeus's justice. And it's in this role that they continue the legacy they had, the legacy of justice that they practiced in life. Now, I want to emphasize that this is my interpretation, and other scholars and classicists might disagree with me, but according to my interpretation, goodness, moral goodness, is important to Hesiod, justice and the virtue of justice, and therefore that the goodness that the golden generation exhibited in life that continues after death, which means on some level moral worth translates into ontological status. That is, if you are good, your condition, your state of being is of a higher quality, and you are able to live after death. And how this really works is a mystery. Plato, as we will see, tries to explain it, but Plato reaches back to Hesiod as the great precedent. Now, if you read more widely in archaic and classical Greek literature, you'll see that individuals become daimones often by obtaining the favor of other gods. And so in the Theogony, Hesiod gives the example of Phaethon, the burning one, who is son of the sun god. I mentioned Ganymede in Theognis, who is lifted up to heaven because Zeus falls in love with him and wants him to serve as his cupbearer. Then there's Rhesus in the play attributed to Euripides, who is related to a river goddess, and becomes a human daimon after death. Darius in Aeschylus's Persians is the Persian emperor, who is called a daimon and a god after death, and a guardian of his people. And finally, Evagrius, who's a ruler of Cyprus, lauded by Isocrates in a speech on Evagrius. He also is said to become daimonic after death because of his good relation with the gods. And this is a pattern that we see. So I'm not arguing, in other words, that in every case a daimonified individual is daimonified because of their moral status. That's actually an exception. But it is there in the tradition, which speaks in multiple voices, and it's that which I want to draw out. One of the more ambiguous cases is in the Orphic cults, and here I say it's ambiguous because it's not, there's sort of a both and. The Orphic initiates attempt to have a blessed afterlife by getting into the good graces of the gods, and specifically Persephone, queen of the underworld. They claim to have a blessed race, or claim to be of the blessed divine race. But purity is also important, and purity can be imagined in several dimensions. Purity may or may not have a moral dimension, but I think a moral dimension is also included. that initiates are expected to do good things, and there is some overlap, in other words, between a pure religious purity and a moral purity. So obviously, if you murder someone, you become impure, both morally and in terms of religious correctness. And so even if the Orphic initiates were simply trying to be religiously correct, they were also, on some level, overlapping with claims to moral purity. There are less ambiguous cases in Greek literature where people become daimones or daimonic due to their good deeds or moral decisions. One of these is Alcestis, as we can see in Euripides' play named Alcestis, and her great deed is to die for the sake of her husband. And she is brought back to life by Heracles. But it's because of her decision that at her gravesite, she was called a daimon, a female daimon. And Pythagoras is another example. In my book, How the Gospels Became History, I talk a little bit about how and why Pythagoreans deified or demonized Pythagoras. Pythagoras was thought to be a demon incarnate, and specifically the demon of Apollo, and there were certain signs of his daimonic status. But the key to remember for Pythagoras is he is again trying to carve out a moral space for life and trying to follow justice. There are obviously certain things about Pythagorean thought that don't seem to be in a moral category, like the prohibition on eating beans. But there are also clear examples where Pythagoras is trying to live in harmony with the universe, refusing to kill animals, trying to live out justice, and refusing war. And it's these elements which I think also reminded people and led them to think that when he died, he had a daimonic nature. So that, at least, is my thesis, and I hope all of you will be able to read how I back it up in my footnotes and detailed discussion in Chapter 1. For now, I thank everybody for coming along and having listened. If you appreciated the content, please leave a like and let me know what you think. Till we meet next time, take care.